I always like to introduce myself a little bit. So I'm Kristopher Mandell. I had my bachelor's studies in San Francisco State University, and during that time I did study abroad, and I studied in Amsterdam in the Netherlands and also in Melbourne, Australia. And I got straight A's all the way through school with full funding. I got an A in statistics. I know, that's crazy for an art person. And then I was accepted to do my graduate studies in Rome in Italy. And then during the pandemic, I came to Calaveras County and fell in love with the landscape, and that's why I'm here. A funny little story. So when I was an undergrad, I was talking to my friend about my aspirations and my degrees in art history, and I said, well, I want to be an art historian. And he said, well, you look more like an art thief. Because I was dressed more or less like this. Yeah. So as far as my jobs here in the community, I am the executive director of the Historical Society. I'm the director of the County Museum in San Andreas. I'm also the director of the Red Barn Museum in San Andreas. And recently, I've been hired as the director of museum operations for MACT for the new tribal museum that's going in here in Angels Camp. So I'm very busy, and I'm running on low fuel, but I've got a really great presentation for you. It's a little bit different. It comes off of my last presentation that I did here, which was about art of the gold rush, and to throw photography into that was just like a rabbit hole that I couldn't go down in an hour. So this is kind of what's brought this up here. All right, so photography of the gold rush. Okay, so to set some parameters for this, the gold rush as a time period, it can be very vague. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to look at photography primarily from 1848 to the late 1860s. And I kind of ended it there because that's about the time that the gold in the placer mines kind of dried up, and they considered the gold rush to be over. So it was really helpful to kind of put those parameters. And I'm really thankful for the outpouring of wonderful photographs from people that have sent them to me, hearing that I was going to do this lecture. And probably for the next one, I'll do a more comprehensive lecture on paper photographs throughout Calaveras County through its history. For this particular lecture and for this time period, we're going to be looking at daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes. Now, I've brought examples of all of those for you to see there from the County Museum. It's one of the privileges of being the director. I'm an art thief, it's true. All right. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise a hand. I'm usually buried in a script here, but I've decided to do something different and just hang out with you guys, look at some images, have a good time. So here we go. All right. So this first daguerreotype that I'm going to show you here is an image of San Francisco in the San Francisco Bay. And all of these are the stacks of ships that were pouring into the bay. And this is a rather famous image. You can see just the amount of ships that were just left and abandoned there. And we all know, well, I shouldn't assume, but we all know that a lot of these ships were taken apart and made into the structures that became San Francisco. A lot of those were, of course, destroyed in the Great Quake. But I think that this is an interesting place to start. So let's go ahead and go through daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes and their invention in succession, in a chronological order. So next I have the daguerreotype. So the daguerreotype. Now, this man is named Louis Jacques Mandel Daguerre. I'm just kidding, that's my name in the middle. So he was born in 1787 and he died in 1851. Now, Daguerre had an interesting background. So he's the inventor of the daguerreotype, which is why he's first. But he was also, he painted sets in Panorama for theater in San Francisco. And his invention of the daguerreotype kind of made him the father of photography. Let's see. So how did he come about developing the daguerreotype? So he partnered in 1829 with a fellow inventor who had produced the world's first photograph in about 1822. Now, that first photograph took about an hour to develop and was very impractical, but Daguerre worked with this man for many years until the man died in about 1833. And Daguerre continued experimenting and created the first daguerreotype. Now, what's interesting is that the French government got a hold of what he was creating, and they decided, hey, don't let this get out. If you sell us the rights to this invention, then we'll give you a pension for life and take care of you. And Daguerre said, hey, okay. So arrangements were made, and then his works were first published in 1839, and France gave it to the world as a gift. So it was free to the world. And that's kind of when things started taking off. Daguerreotypes first became popular in France, and then England, and then Italy. And then during that time, the daguerreotypes were exhibited in world expos and things like this. And that's kind of how it came to America in about 1840. I'm throwing a lot of information at you. It's going to get fun in a minute. Now, the first daguerreotype is this wonderful image that I just love. It's called View of Boulevard du Temple. It was taken in 1838 in Paris. Now, this being the first daguerreotype, there's some interesting things to point out here. If you can see in the foreground here, there's a man that we believe is getting his shoes shined. And although it looks like an abandoned street, there were actually cars going through, but they were moving too fast to be picked up by the exposure. This is a very famous image that's been repeated many times. And you can already see the principles of photography starting to develop. We've got the road kind of going away into nothingness in the background, these wonderful views of buildings and trees that are very much curated, but actually a part of everyday space. Now, here we go with the first daguerreotype camera. Now, the camera looks very unassuming, and I'll go into some of the plate technologies, but unlike our cameras now that just kind of do everything for you, this was just one part of a very elaborate process. Now, so here we're looking at the daguerreotype process. As you can see, the camera is actually the middle guy there. And there are many processes leading up to the actual taking of the daguerreotype, and then many processes after for development. So here's a little bit about daguerreotype processes. The daguerreotype is a direct positive process, creating a highly detailed image on a sheet of copper plated with a thin coat of silver without the use of a negative. The process required great care. The silver-plated copper plate had first to be cleaned and polished until the surface looked like a mirror. Next, the plate was sensitized in a closed box over iodine until it took on a yellow-rose appearance. The plate, held a light-proof holder, was then transferred to the camera. After exposure to light, the plate was developed over hot mercury until an image appeared. To fix the image, the plate was immersed in a solution of sodium thiosulfate, or salt, and then toned with gold chloride. So there's a lot of working parts in a daguerreotype. It took a lot to do. And there's this great quote by Daguerre that I just love. He says, "I have seized the light, I have arrested its flight." Yes. So so this is a bit about the process here. Extremely toxic. So the question was, what about mercury? And yes, just about everything in these original processes were very detrimental to your health, for sure. Over time, I think one of the main reasons for photography evolving was to get away from these toxic chemicals. But even modern photography still uses some pretty out there stuff, just to say. This is an interesting picture here that goes over the different parts in a daguerreotype kit. Now, to get these up to a place like Calaveras, it would have taken a lot. To bring a whole studio up would have taken mules and donkeys and such. What's interesting is up here it says camera obscura. Now, where camera obscura comes from is from the Renaissance with the works of Caravaggio. So the original camera obscura, basically they used kind of like a shield to project an image through a mirror through a thin point, and it appeared upside down on the wall on the other side, and then the artist would trace this and then kind of cheat. Basically, it was cheating. When Daguerre developed this invention, he definitely borrowed the camera obscura, and that's kind of the roots there. All right. So this is just a very good example of a daguerreotype, which I haven't given you yet. They were encased, and in the museum world, we tend to call these encased photographs. Now, the reason for that is that because there's daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, we managed to kind of fit these nicely into these cases, and so that makes it easier to talk about them generally. Now, this is an interesting image. So this is the Rich family. I like it that their name's Rich. They migrated to California during the gold rush. It's important to understand that the daguerreotype was in use in California before the gold rush happened. There were studios in San Francisco, mostly small portrait studios. But the gold rush literally incited the daguerreotype with a new practical use to document the gold rush. But not only that, all of the people, well, not all, many of the people coming to find their fortunes, these Argonauts, they carried these with them as keepsakes of their families. And many times they also would get a daguerreotype taken and send it home to their families. Now, daguerreotypes were a one-of-a-kind image. It isn't like photography now where you could just reproduce this over and over. The only way to reproduce a daguerreotype was to take a daguerreotype of another daguerreotype, like photocopy, basically. So these were very precious images. Now, the gold rush was basically fertile ground for this invention. And it took form in portraiture, but also in the field. Okay, let's talk about ambrotypes. So an ambrotype is the same process, except for you didn't have to do this laborious polishing of the copper plate and covering it with silver. They just managed to get it onto glass. And then what they would do is just put the glass onto a matte black background, sometimes velvet. So that's really the only difference that we're looking at there. A lot of times you can tell a ambrotype because that background is broken or distorted and it didn't hold up well. So a lot of times when I'm looking at these things, I'm like, oh, that's an ambrotype, obviously. Now, the next one is a tintype. Now, tintypes were a similar process, except for it was obviously on tin. Now, these were very economical, and so at the time they weren't considered to be high photography. And it's important also to note that photography was not considered an art when it first came about. It was considered to be kind of a newfangled machine. And people looked at it and said, how could this be art? There's no method, there's nothing like this going on with it. But obviously, anything that's gone through that much process, we have to start considering it art, and that came a bit later. Now, this is my favorite tintype in the whole collection. If the downtown museum in San Andreas was on fire, this is what I would run out with. And I did bring it for you guys to look at here today. Now, tintypes could be produced in a multiple sheet. And what you'll notice here looking is that their feet are above them. So with some magic here, I cut off their above feet, and then I reattached it to the bottom. So this is the first time we really get to see their feet. If you guys want to see that again, it's fun. I worked really hard on this. The feet. Yes. It's so good to see them put back together. All right. Oh, and it's also the picture on my hoodie here. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about daguerreotypes. Now, the daguerreotype process for the person being photographed was actually quite horrible. You had to sit still for 3 to 10, 15 minutes sometimes. And what they developed was these armatures to kind of hold your head up so that you could rest your head. And I really like this daguerreotype where she's like, yeah, I'm getting my picture taken, it's so nice, you know. But that is not how it is. It's more like the one on this side here. It was actually extremely excruciating. So instead of, this is so nice, it actually looked more like this. As we can see clearly, the man is really not comfortable and not enjoying his portrait. Another thing about the daguerreotype is that it scared people. So you get ones like this. It's okay to laugh, I know it's weird. The only way that I could really explain it to you is if, in our modern day, if you've ever gone in for an MRI and you're kind of confronted with this giant donut that they want to put you in, and it's scary, and they say, okay, don't move, and you're like, you know, this is definitely what we're getting here with this. It's actually a wonderful daguerreotype. I don't mean to make fun of it, but, you know, it's a very interesting expression. So the daguerreotype medium really took off, and with that, different types of photography. So in the Victorian era, one of the things that was very prevalent was death portraits, and I have one here. So a lot of times what would happen is your loved one would die, and to immortalize them, you would sit for a daguerreotype with your dead child, as in this picture. Or you would just take a casket daguerreotype. Or a lot of times people would use that armature and try to make them look like they're still living as a way to memorialize them.
So this baby is dead?
The baby's dead, yeah. Yeah. You know, but we have to think back to a time when there wasn't this plethora of images. And this was your last time to really have something to remember your loved one by, which is also why tintypes became so popular during the Civil War. This was a way to memorialize your folks going off to war. They get a bit creepy. So here is probably, there's no information on this except for that this is probably a medical student or an anthropologist. I don't really want to get on my soapbox about why 19th century anthropology is so awful, but I think this image is a really good indication. these 19th century anthropologists just thought that anything dead and buried was theirs. And it's interesting because now in our age, we're looking at repatriation of a lot of these ancestors. Mostly, a lot of times, these were from native burials and such. So this is an interesting and kind of dark example of 19th century daguerreotypes.
Are all of these pictures in the Calaveras collection?
No. So I've actually pulled these from a lot of different sources. One of them especially is the Greater California Library. Also other places. You can really just go on a great ride on Google looking at these great daguerreotypes, and I really encourage you to do that. So here's a fun one. This guy, obviously a French clown. And daguerreotypes started to be really popular for immortalizing performers. Now, this is one of my favorites. This is P.T. Barnum and General Tom Thumb. Again, immortalizing performers. So this was taken by a man named Samuel Root. And Root is probably the only artist that I'll be really looking at here. So this man had a terrible life. I'll just say that. So in 1856, Root invested $40,000 into a hotel in Cape Cod, and then it was entirely destroyed by a deadly fire 3 months later. While preparing for a New York City gallery opening for his daguerreotypes in 1856, Root was seriously injured in a train accident. He was standing on a train platform in Ohio when two trains collided, throwing cars into the rotunda of the station and part of a hotel, killing 8 people, including a man standing right next to him. Root's leg was crushed and the thigh was severely fractured, leaving him crippled for the rest of his life. The engineer responsible fled, according to the newspaper reports. Root's lawyer collected the damages, and he also fled. So he didn't get any of this money at all. During his lengthy recovery, Root authored an exhaustive history of American photography, which was really great, and it's entitled The Camera and the Pencil. Root argued for photographers to be considered alongside painters. So this was really the person that kind of pushed daguerreotypes and photography into the art world. And then the poor guy, he fell from a streetcar in 1885, and he spent the rest of his life in seclusion until he died from his injuries 3 years later in Philadelphia. So just a really gnarly story there. The reason I'm focusing on him is this. Does anybody know who this is? Okay, so this is Jenny Lind. Yeah, so Jenny Lind, as we know, is a township in Calaveras County. It's interesting to note that Jenny Lind never actually came to Calaveras County. However, we do have the name for her. And this was one of Root's first daguerreotypes that really propelled him into fame. Yes, she's a very interesting person. I recommend looking at her. Here's another image of Root's, a daguerreotype of a really great family. I love all the attitude of the kid in the middle, these wonderful clothes. But what is really interesting here is that it's extremely difficult in art to make a composition with 5 figures. I have put here next to it an image of Picasso's. This is 5 figures, the Mademoiselle d'Avignon. He was one of the first people to really start working with the 5-figure placement in the composition, and I think it's really interesting how Root has nailed it way before Picasso in this great daguerreotype of a family. Now, where would you go to get a daguerreotype? I think most people would understand that daguerreotypes were kind of a shop that you would walk into. This was in San Francisco, 1854 to 1855. It says daguerrean rooms there. I don't know if you can see it too well there. But there were also ones like this. This one's great. So this was a daguerrean saloon. So it kind of looks like an old rail car. The guy has really made it into an interesting studio. It's got kind of these, I don't know really what to call them, but the roof kind of comes up to get more light, maybe to let some heat out. What I really like about this is the farmers in the back there. So because I'm a theater person, I'm always thinking, well, you know, what are they saying, you know? And I think in this one, they're kind of like, hey, Jim Bob, you're looking fancy. Why don't you, oh, Mr. Fancy Man with your newfangled invention, you know? And the other guy's like, hey, don't you want to get in here and deal with this rotten hay that you left here, you know? So this is a fun one to me. Now, this one's really exciting. I just found this one. So this is a daguerreotype studio in McCallamy Hill. It's a half plate. Oh, I should have told you. So daguerreotypes came in different size plates. There'd be a full plate, half plate, quarter plate, and each one of them cost a different amount of money, of course. But I really think that this is a wonderful image here. It's a very raw McCallamy Hill. I love it that there's the stabling next door. As you can see on the central pillar there, the man has some of his daguerreotypes on display, which was customary. Often daguerreotypists had their own galleries. So this is nice. All right. That's the background. Now the fun stuff. So we're going to look at daguerreotypes 1848 to 1870. The following daguerreotypes are all from California during the gold rush, so I'll just lay that blanket on it. And I've broke these down into some categories here to make them a little bit more digestible. So the first one is portraiture, the next is documentary, and then artistic and contrived. And I'll go into it a little bit about why I've broken these down. The first one is portraiture, and I will say that the major breadth of daguerreotypes is mostly portraiture. This one is great. So I think this is a really good image of our gold rush. And if you'll notice, the man actually has gold in the pan, and daguerreotypes actually did have color. So I think that in this particular daguerreotype, that's real gold dust on the plate. But what they did was, when they wanted reds or blues, they would take xanthan gum, and then they would put a little colorant in it. They'd drop it on the daguerreotype, and then they would blow on it. So this is a very delicate operation, and these things have exquisite workmanship and craftsmanship involved. So this is your common portrait, young woman, her Sunday hat, some finery showing her prestige and her class. Daguerreotypes were mostly for the rich. So yeah, this is kind of your standard daguerreotype that you'll see. And to give you an estimate, random daguerreotypes like this are usually between like $30 to $100 in today's market. Now, to juxtapose this, I have this great image of Mary A. McCloskey, or is it John B. Colton? So the historic record has got convoluted around this person, who was more than likely a transgender woman living in California during the gold rush. I just find this image fantastic. I'm so glad that we have it. It documents LGBTQ lifestyles during the gold rush, which is a very underrepresented field. And it's just her swag. Like the way that she's wearing those men's clothes, the evolution into her older years where she's become more comfortable with the men's clothes. She's even got a bit of a mustache there. Just an all-around amazing image. Now, usually what you'll see a lot in daguerreotypes is these portraits of ceremony, a lot of wedding portraits and such. And that can be contrasted with a widow. And the widow is clutching a daguerreotype, and we could probably assume that that daguerreotype is probably her loved one that has passed. Now, this is a pair of fiddlers. I don't have a lot to say, I just really like it. And I like to think about the gold rush when, you know, whole towns would be dancing around two fiddles. This was very common. It wasn't like elaborate dance halls. This is actually another very interesting step here. So this is Sacramento Masons. Now, I could go on and on about Calaveras and Masons, and I've written a very good article in Los Calaveras if you guys happen to want to read it. But the Masons came to California with the gold rush, and there's a Masonic hall in just about every town in our counties. And this is a very interesting example because they're wearing this full regalia, which is something that you never actually see. Now, what I'd like you to notice is that they have their hands kind of holding onto each other's shoulders. Now, in this time, it wasn't uncommon for men to appear affectionate towards each other in these images. And I think a lot of people, they see these and they're like, whoa, this is so intense. But we're in a different period. Back then, it was okay for men to show affection to each other, just straight up. Now, here's one of my other favorites. This is a tintype kind of showing the same thing, but with a lot of humor. But yet at the same time, they're kind of holding hands there. And I love the smile of this man. You can really tell that they're friends. So this is a very awesome image too. So let's talk about documentary. So here's a good example of the process of coloring daguerreotypes, as I explained a little earlier. But what we want to look at here is we're beginning to get images of mining. And we can see this long tom, sluice box, a diverted water channel, all of these folks working really hard for that gold that's in the placers. Another great image is one that many of us have seen. And this is the head of Auburn Ravine in Placer County in 1852. Now, what is this image is mostly famous for is that it actually incorporates and tells the story of Chinese miners who came to California during the gold rush. This image is also curated by Judith into the downtown museum on the wall, and it's wonderful. So we're starting to get this documentary aspect of the daguerreotype, where we're actually looking at a place and time, being objective about the people that were there, and really getting a sense of what life was like. So this one is really great. So this is Angels Camp in 1852, and the man holding a shovel in the middle is a man named Petey. I have nothing else there. Maybe a historian in the room knows a little bit about Petey. And then also John Comstock. who was born about 1817. Now, this is a kind of overdeveloped daguerreotype, but you can imagine the sun kind of beating down. We've got a wonderful wheel up there in the kind of mid-background. We're getting examples of kind of diverting a water channel, the amount of time that they spent kind of digging this ditch and working it to make it a viable mill. Now, these are two daguerreotypes of the men in the picture. So Petey is the Dapper Dan with the top hat. And you can tell that's an ambrotype because you can see how it's deteriorated in the back. And then Comstock is the other fellow. And I think that this is probably a tintype, especially because of all the scratches. Daguerreotypes had that glass plate, so they didn't really withstand that much damage. Here's another great image of Poverty Bar in Calaveras County. Does anybody know where Poverty Bar is? Judith. Go ahead. Yeah, so it's under the Comanche Reservoir. It's gone now. But this is a really great photo of a place that isn't there anymore. Again, we have the men at work, the methods of which they were mining, and the water wheel, all around giving a beautiful image. And it's also a very documentary aspect that teaches us how these people lived and how they mined. These kind of documentary daguerreotypes take on a great deal of importance when we're looking back to understand the gold rush and its processes. Now, here is a wonderful daguerreotype of Murphy's Camp. So this one's a quarter plate, and if you look down the street there, I'm not a Murphy's expert. Of course, I've almost go there almost every weekend, but still a lot of times it's hard to place exactly where these photos are. But as you can see, there is a tin shop, I think on your right. Yes. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that those tin shops were producing tintypes, so that's an interesting thing there. Yeah.
They also produce tin for roofing, almost like tiles.
Okay.
And the building on the left is Philip Birmingham Hotel, which is approximately the location of the present Murphy's Hotel.
Oh, wow. Very good. And for those on CCTV, I'll just say that Judith said that they would also use tin as shingles, and that this was, what's the name of the owner? Philip Birmingham. Yeah, so that was his hotel, and it's almost in the same place as the Murphy's Hotel is now. It's just a great image, and I was really, really excited to be able to find these daguerreotypes that actually placed here in our county. So here we go with an image from Jacksonville in Tuolumne County. Looking at this, I've been trying, did I spell it wrong? Oh, okay.
I know where that is. I know where Jackson is.
So,
Jacksonville's under the lake.
oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'm the director of the Calaveras County Historical Society. But what I'd like you to look at here is kind of what's going on. So behind the facade on the roof, there's obviously a major problem there. And I think that what's in the foreground is probably shingles. Yeah. So, you know, it's fun to take stabs and guesses about what's going on in these daguerreotypes. But that's all they are, is stabs and guesses, because we can't be there. But I really think that that's probably what's going on there. Yeah.
There's a little bit of a
Huh?
There's a spelling error also, provisions.
Oh, yes.
So the comment was that provisions is spelled wrong. Oh, man, that was really big and took some time. Oh, yeah, we live with these things. So here's another one from Tuolumne County. This is Big Oak Flat. That's Fred stalking his wife Lucinda and their partners. I really love this one where she's kind of like, I'll do my needlework while you guys work in the hot sun, and I'll hang out with the dog. This is really great. But at least there is a woman represented in the daguerreotype outside of portraiture, which doesn't happen very often. Oh, one thing that I'd like to tell you guys before I forget. So this grouping of Petey and Comstock with this image from Angel's Camp is currently on auction for $50,000. Yeah, and you know, I really wish the foundation would get me a couple daguerreotypes. I'm just kidding. But I really think it would be great in the world if people would start just returning these to the places that they came from. You know, like, I would love it if someone just mailed me these and said, hey, I really think that this would benefit your community. But maybe this isn't the world that we're living in. So back. All right. Now, this is an interesting daguerreotype, and it kind of figures in the development of journalism and photography. So it memorializes the cruel death of James, King of William. He was the editor of the San Francisco Evening Bulletin, and there was a public lynching of his murderer, James P. Casey. On the evening of May 14th, 1856, King of William, he legally had his name changed to of William to distinguish himself from other James Kings. He was a muckraking journalist who fought local vice and corruption. He was shot outside of his office by Casey, who was a local politician and a rival editor of the Sunday Times. In that day's editorial, King of William had accused Casey of election fraud and of being an ex-convict who had served time in New York at Sing Sing for robbing his mistress. The city rose up in arms, and several days later, the King of William died, and a mob of vigilantes removed Casey from the sheriff's office and lynched him from gallows erected on an abandoned liquor warehouse. This was very common, especially in San Francisco, for people to just take care of business. And, you know, I looked at this several times and I thought, well, this is a very well exposed daguerreotype, so I wanted to show it to you. But also there's this great banner, "The great man has fallen, we mourn his loss." And I just had to know more, and I wanted to tell you more.
You know, this is almost 10 years since you said daguerreotype stopped. Do they not have to hold still as long then? Has it changed?
So to be clear, daguerreotypes did continue, even during the times that other types were brought in. But primarily, daguerreotypes were the best, so they continued, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, they're standing so very still for 10 minutes or 3 minutes?
Oh, okay. Also, as daguerreotypes evolved, the different lenses made it possible for that time to be less. Yeah. That's a really good observation. Thanks. All right. Now, to round this out, not the whole lecture, but this section, I love this piece. It says, "Our California home, Vallecito, August 1853. And this is just such a great image of Vallecito that we don't really think much about Vallecito in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe some of us live there. But there's some wonderful things going on in this daguerreotype. So I really appreciate the wonderful character in the man's dress that's standing. There's also these kind of lighter places on the ground, and my mind would like to believe that that's where people slept outside. And then also there's a large slit in the tent roof there. And I'm not sure whether that's to let the heat out or just an accident and maybe kind of rounding out their camp. I think that home for these folks might be kind of tongue-in-cheek. But the wonderful oak trees of Vallecito are very well represented here. So I really find this to be probably the most special that I have to show you. Okay, so this last section I've called artistic or contrived. Now, I'm just looking at my next slide. It's kind of strange. So the daguerreotype as a medium became artistic, and it's artistic in a sense of the images being contrived. So that's kind of why I've put artistic and contrived. I think that we'll look at this one again. You can see how whoever took the daguerreotype has said, okay, everybody stand here and look this direction. And it's interesting in photography, especially through its development. We started using photography to lie. There were a lot of photographs that they would take in a battlefield scene, and they would strew the bodies and cannonballs to make the scene look much worse than it was. So it's important to understand that these weren't candid, natural images. These were very much thought through or designed to create and elicit an emotional response.
He's got a heck of a lot of gold in that man.
Doesn't he? So the comment was, he's got a lot of gold. I know, he should go home that day. So this one is a real, just rip your heart out of your chest and stomp it on the ground kind of daguerreotype. Now, I think a lot of that comes from the expression in this man's eyes. He is just lonely, forlorn, in a different world. He's holding an image and a letter, probably from his loved ones, maybe back east or somewhere abroad. And there's a real sense of urgency in this image, and whoever took the daguerreotype really wanted you to feel what it was like to be so far away from home. Now, I've juxtaposed this with Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, which was a very famous image that really brought home the realities of the Dust Bowl to the American people. Now, looking at them together, you almost see that same expression in the eyes. And I'm not saying that Dorothea Lange was influenced by this daguerreotype, but it's interesting to look at them together and consider how the photograph elicits that emotional response inside of us. When we think about, what would this be like if it was me? What was it like for my parents? Things like this. Now, here's another with a similar theme. So in this one, we have Chinese woman with daguerreotype. Again, probably a daguerreotype and a letter from family members. Maybe this one she was actually going to send home. We don't really know. But I will say that the Chinese American community have really taken on this image and used it to really convey the Chinese experience during the gold rush. Now, I'm going to edit out the little dark comment that I was going to say there, and we'll just appreciate this wonderful image of a Chinese American woman. As I said, daguerreotypes were about class, and because of that, the medium was really separatist in a lot of the images that were produced. The daguerreotypist really had to want to convey that same emotional response to the viewer, and to document the struggle of Chinese American women. Now here's a really fun one. So this is Isaac Wallace Baker and a friend playing cards. Baker is actually the one that took the daguerreotype of Murphy's that I showed earlier. So that's kind of special. I really love it. I don't know if you guys can see it, but if you get real close, he has a great hand of cards. And the other guy, he really doesn't. Yeah, and you can see these different expressions. There's fun there, and there's also a really good poignant message about the luck of the draw in the gold rush, the winners and the losers, those that are staying and those that are going home. And his expression is just so great. He's like, look, I'm gonna beat him. I just love it. So I'm wrapping up to the last slide. I'm not really sure what time I'm at here, but there'll be time for questions. So this is William Herman Rolifson displaying a paper photograph, and this is an ambrotype. And again, this is very artistic and contrived. You see the man coming through the door in the background, this really great angle and line that kind of makes a very nice triangle in the composition between the hat, the shoe, and the back of the man. And then the wonderful circular design that comes with this rocking chair. And the reason that I kind of picked this one for last is that he's holding a paper photograph. And I think that really leads in well to the lecture that I'll give next year. So there you go. Daguerreotypes in the Gold Rush.
That was great, thank you so much.
Sure, is there any questions?
The one where they have the different colored shirts on,
Yeah.
would that have, I assume, cost a whole lot more money?
Yes. So let me see if I can find it. The question is, did the color agent process cost more money? Yes, very much so. And it's also, a lot of times with the tintypes over here, people left the whole thing black and white except for like their dog. You know, so we're able to tell by the amount more that it would have costed how important that figure was to the person who made it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, this is the tintype, right? Is it the tint? When you understand, some of them look very clear.
Right.
Others were more, like that one just had, the building looked more rougher, and that one looked clean. So was that just the type they were using then?
Okay, so this is actually a daguerreotype of a daguerreotype scanned. And so that's why you're losing the wonderful color that is actually present in daguerreotypes. There just wasn't any other example. A lot of these are just lost and gone. They don't exist anymore, and we just have some etchings or engravings of the daguerreotypes at some points. But to your point, tintypes, they were a lot more susceptible to scratching. This is a better example. You can just see all the scratches, nicks, marks. The tin, it tends to bend, as we know, like crushing a tin can. So these are very sensitive, and they really costed a lot less money. But that doesn't change the fact that they're wonderful by any means.
So when it was taken, what you as a person bought is what, got a tin photograph? Is that what you got? What did you receive?
So they did package these in the same encasings that they made daguerreotypes with, or it was a little paper sleeve. And there's some examples over there that I brought where you can see it's just not as fancy, you know. Yeah. Sure.
The process going through to take these pictures explains why when I look at pictures of some of my ancestors, they look really scary.
Yeah, yeah.
Scariest time, but some of them just look real scary.
Yeah, and you know, it's really true. But I think that we all grew up with our families saying, smile, say cheese, you know, and that's really just not how things were then. Nobody thought that you had to smile in your photograph. I think that they would have thought that it wouldn't be an adequate likeness of the individual. Life was hard, you know. I really think not only was it uncomfortable to sit for the daguerreotype, but it was just a really hard life, especially if you look at some of these people's hands in these images, like in this tintype. His arm is just, you can see the veins and these giant hands from working in the placers. It was just a very difficult life.
I had a neighbor in Clovis who was from Yugoslavia, and he had us over for dinner one night, and then he asked us if we'd like to see pictures of his family from back in Yugoslavia, and they were all people in their coffins.
Yeah,
I'm like, what?
yeah,
Yeah, and that's what they took pictures of. They took pictures of them after they were dead.
yeah.
Sitting going, okay, I think I've seen enough of your family.
Yeah, and that was really one of the primary functions of daguerreotypes, especially in the Victorian era. And these are really highly sought after now by collectors, even though they are definitely part of the macabre. There's something that's very curious to people. Yeah, yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because I think what's so affronting to us is being invited into that intimate moment of death. Especially with this mother and child, you know, we shouldn't be there, right? You know, but this was a one-of-a-kind object that was probably just for her. Yeah.
I've often thought how fortunate that this was all invented in time for the gold rush and the Civil War.
Yeah.
The photos that we've seen of both.
Right.
Amazing.
So the comment was that the evolution of photography came at a very apropos moment. And that is something that is a primary point that I should have said in here somewhere, is that they couldn't have happened at a better moment for us for documenting the gold rush, for sure. And that's kind of why I'd like to take this lecture further, is to kind of show the development of different cameras, the pictures that they took, and make it all Calaveras related. Me and Judith have been talking about this a bit. Sure, Judith.
I was going to say that I.W. Baker, when he was in Vallecito in 1853, he was also an artist. And I think you've seen in our
Baker.
book that very nice map of Vallecito in 1853 with all the buildings depicted. But the most important thing, he has a painting of what he calls he calls Vallecito Indians. And they are dressed in mission clothing. They seem to be the Indians that Murphy brought to what was later called Murphy's Old Diggings
Right.
from Santa Clara, Mission Santa Clara, and then married into the local Native American population. So he had many talents.
Yeah, so Judith is bringing up a very important point. There was a large component of documentation of Native Americans in daguerreotypes. I've left it out of this presentation because I feel like the images are very unsettling. They're very much contrived. They often are degrading in their imagery. So yes, especially the plains. There are a lot of daguerreotypes out there that document the Indian experience. Yeah. Susan.
So my grandparents immigrated from Croatia, and I was at one of our family funerals where people were taking pictures, and I thought that was really an odd thing to do. But what it was explained to me was that the family back in the old country couldn't be at the funeral, so they took pictures so they could send them back
Right.
to family members that couldn't be here.
Right. And that was definitely the case with daguerreotypes. I think what's kind of left out of that equation is that they're just really delicate. I don't know how they made it. the ones that we have in our collection, I barely touch. I barely let them out to be exposed to light. They're glass. And the thought that they could make it that far, and they did, is kind of mind-boggling to me. But I think when you put yourself in the place of receiving a daguerreotype from California from someone that you haven't seen for 2 years, what an emotional experience that must have been, and what a gift in the world. Any others?
Do we have one on display?
Daguerreotype? Oh, sure. We have the ones that I brought. I know Angels Camp Museum does have some. I also volunteer here every once in a while. I'm all over this place. I am not sure if they're on display at this time, but please do check these out. There's a really beautiful one of Julia Perano, who was an Angels Camp resident, who I just love. I think she's great. So yeah, check those out on your way out.